right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out today for our first program since the museum closed because of COVID last year in March. So we're really excited to have you all back in here. As a note, please do, while you are in the building, make sure to keep your mask fully over your nose and mouth the entire time so that we can protect ourselves and everyone around us as much as we possibly can. So I do appreciate your cooperation and help with that. My name is Caitlin Hoffman-Mahoney. I'm the curator of collections here at the Matheson History Museum. And we are really excited to welcome author James Chapin today to talk about his new book, Ride South Until the Sawgrass. So James's work has appeared in the Washington Post, the Tampa Bay Times, Slate, the Image Journal, and his first filing was in Gainesville's The Fine Print. This is his debut novel, and it was published in 2020. He is a graduate of the University of Florida and currently lives in DeLand. And if you are joining us virtually, welcome to you as well. If you have any questions as we get to the Q&A section at the end, please do put them into the chat, and I will share those with the presenter so that we can get those answered for you as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to James.
Spill or destroy anything else today. Had a couple drops already. Hopefully we're past that. Thank you all so much for being here. And thank you to Matheson for having me. This is really an honor, and I'm just so pleased to be able to bring in this this period where we're able to do things like this, hopefully, if we are safe and wise with it. This is a really, this is particularly special for me. I spent a lot of time in this very space when I was beginning to write this book, and while I was figuring out what it meant to write a book like this, what a resource, what an incredible place. I wrote about half of this novel on 4th Street right there, and the other half in Melrose. So I was in close proximity to this building whenever possible, because there's just so much here. So because this is kind of like a little bit of an origin point for this book, I'm going to start with a little reading from the very beginning of this book, and I'm going to hopefully be able to bring in a little bit from the walls of this place, be in conversation a little bit with what's around us, because obviously we have no shortage of just incredible information and inspiration around us, I feel. So I'm going to begin at the beginning, because that's what this place kind of is for me. The man and the woman faced each other on opposite ends of the crosscut saw. They lifted it up from its resting place and brought it outside. The saw was 7 feet long, and they carried it like a stretcher into the trees. It flexed with every step they took, and the sunlight it reflected loped and danced along the undersides of the branches. They reached the tree, a grand old pine, dying. The man had been watching it since they first came to that clearing 3 months ago, when they were new to that place and new to each other. He made a notch cut in one side with an axe, and then they took up the saw together. They laughed at first and were clumsy with the back and forth, but soon the saw bit through the bark and into the wood. The man and the woman pulled against each other. They were well matched. Clean chips spat from the kerf, and a scent of turpentine surrounded them. They made decent progress, but it was dense wood. After 100 strokes or so, the man spoke up over the noise, breathing in time with the saw blade. It was only possible to speak while pulling. "Let me know if you," he said. "What?" the woman said. "Let me know if you want to stop." "I ain't stopping if you ain't stopping." "Well then, I guess we'll keep going." "I guess so." 40 strips later, they were deep in the Heartwood. It was not a very broad tree, but it was old and the pitch had gathered down at the base. When the tree finally fell, they would have a supply of lighter nut for a long time. That tree would start years' worth of campfires and cook fires, and fires to heat a tub for bathing in the winter, and fires to heat a tub for scalding slaughtered hogs. It contained not to be lit at night at the sound of strangers' voices in the yard, and to ward off the mince and yawp of wolves, keeping them at the tree line. And eventually, much later, a scrap or two of that tree, lost among others, would start hearth fires to heat old arthritic knees not 100 feet from where the couple now stood, young and laboring and pulling cleanly at the blade. 50 strokes later, the man grimaced or grinned through his sweat. Lord, whoever taught you to saw. You know, I lived plenty of life before you, Quinto. Learned a lot of things. What? Hell. 25 years old. Watch out, the woman said, and she stepped back from the tree. The man yanked on the crosscut saw unopposed, and he stumbled backward to land on his elbows, and they both looked up. The tree moved, tipping against the high clouds. Or maybe the treetop was holding still, and the clouds were moving. It was hard to tell. They stood there for a long time, puzzling over that question, craning backward to look at the sky. It ain't going to, the man said, standing back up. Shh, the woman said. And now the movement of the tree or clouds had a sound accompanying it, a groaning noise and a pop, and then a few more pops, and then the last few needles left in the pine trap shushed through the air on their long arc down to earth, which leapt a little when the old tree struck home. Then it was silence. They looked at the pine laying lengthwise on the ground, and the palmettos crushed flat beneath it. And they looked across the round stump at what was left standing. Each other, the two of them spotlit by a sudden opening in the canopy. So that's the start of this book, and this is right South Until the Sawgrass, and this is the novel I wrote, and this is, as I say, this is like the best possible place I can be reading this, I feel, for me personally. I realized I didn't say much or anything about the book before I started reading. We're all doing new stuff these days. We're all getting better at surviving right now. So this novel is set in the territorial period of Florida. And I won't put numbers on it, but let's just say fairly close to where we are right now, in the early to mid 1800s. Obviously, when Florida is not a state, but is a very poorly ruled territory of the United States of America. So we're here and not far from this place right now, and we are rolling into the state of Florida. I wanted to bring in a little bit about this Matheson Museum, what we have going on here right now, because there's an exhibit called Trailblazers, 150 years of the Alachua County woman, and you just met one of them. You just met Lucy Quinto as she was sawing down a tree, and she's an Alachua County woman, all right. And this is, I think that she may be a decent exemplar of what some of the fine people around this room stood for. And I just want to read a little bit from that text over here. This exhibition highlights the lives and accomplishments of 11 women from Alachua County. Women's voices can be hard to find in historical records. Often their names are lost and we only remember them by their husband's name. In some cases, we would not even find a photograph of our subject. I couldn't agree more. Women's voices are hard to find in some of these archives. And I just hope that someone like Lucy in this book kind of stands in that gap. Yeah, I see this fiction is working kind of in concert with what a place like this with archives and so much material, isn't able to have. However, it's, a fiction writer needs a place like this a lot more than a museum needs the fiction. To be clear, it's an asymmetrical relationship, but but it's very hand in hand. I think they work in concert to tell the story of a place like Florida. And they give us some people you can't make up. I would invite you to read about Sarah Lucretia Raw when you get a chance, because you know that's a fine example of Alachua County woman. I think she was the first doctor. Let me see if I have this right. First female physician in Alachua County and one of the first in Florida. And she would make home visits in her horse and buggy, working out of a small clinic in her home, and said horse and buggy are pictured there. And yeah, it's born in 1852. So she could be the child, the daughter of Nat and Lucy Quinto, who are the couple I read about here. I'm going to read another section. Their wagon was rickety, but it held up. This is when they're coming, first initially arriving in Florida territory. Their wagon was rickety, but it held up. It didn't have much to carry. Their larger belongings were lashed to the walls, and most of the floor was taken up by a large mattress. In this way, the wagon was not much more than an ox-drawn bed chamber rolling down the trail. Hanging pots and pans clanged together now and then. A crate containing a few white chickens hung from the back like a lantern. Nat Quinto had used all his savings to purchase the ox and the wagon. He'd been a lumberman on the St. Mary's River in Georgia. A recession had come and broken the industry and set him adrift. He and all his fellow sawyers were turned out from the company houses and given no pay at all for the last 1,000 board feet. This betrayal had sent Quinto into a slow fury. He was a peaceful man at heart, but he had such rages sometimes. They were very rare, but burned very hot, and they often resulted in decisions like this one, to leave that country immediately for a place where there would be no man to count on for his eating or his starving, where only God himself was exchequer. He was not sure such a place existed, but he guessed that it did, and he guessed that he would die if he did not find it. He and Lucy were recently married, and she agreed to go. He got the destination from an old man at the lumber camp who described a friendly roadhouse in the Florida territory called Mrs. Monroe's and a fair country south of that. Quinto purchased his ox and wagon in town and left the very next day. They had been traveling ever since. They did not hurry. There was no need for hurry. Neither of them required haste or speed to hold them to a decision. South of the creek they passed, they saw little sign of human life, save for one day when they came off the trail to eat. The pretty place where they aimed to stop was no natural opening or meadow, but a Seminole crop field, as were many other such clearings in that landscape. The owners were there tending it. When the Quinto's noisy wagon broke through the trees, half of the head suddenly dropped below the corn stalks. The rest held still, watching. But as the wagon kept going, and its two passengers gave small gestures of goodwill, the faces that had ducked out of view reappeared one by one and rejoined the others, and the whole party, both African and Seminole, recommenced their labors. Nat kept the ox wagon moving. "They're here, then," Lucy said, as if she hadn't already known it. "They are," Nat said. "Their corn's tall, too." It didn't look like they bothered with us, did it? No, it didn't. Let's try and keep it that way. How? Lucy said darkly. Same way as with anyone, I expect, Nat said. By not by God meddling with them, not stirring things, not with a gun or a tomahawk, nor laying hands on things in ours. They went on in silence for a while. "I want to ride with you," Lucy said. "Well then," Nat said, "come on." You did not have to stop the wagon. Lucy just jumped down from the tailgate and walked alongside the slow-moving vehicle until she came even with the front. Nat's hand was there, extended. She took it and swung up onto the bench. His single hat was enough to shade them both from the sun if they held close enough together. So that's the picture of the arrival into Florida territory that people may have experienced. And I think it introduces the fact that these would by no means be the first inhabitants of this particular region. And I think that, I'm in a room and, William Bartram is like staring me down from the back wall there. And as he well knew, this landscape had been profoundly altered by human use long before Euro-American visitation. And so, that's always a challenge that of course, Europeans would have is just walking into a place anywhere in the continent of North America and seeing these beautiful meadows, not understanding that meadows were meadows because they had been made meadows by the native people of that land through processes such as prescribed fire and other methods of using the landscape. So much of this book is about like the interplay of people between the landscape and the landscape itself, and surviving off of it, and it gives and takes away. I'm going to read a little bit more from their earliest sort of encounter with what the harshness of this place would have been. I think that we all kind of have that accessible to us as Floridians. Like you always get the fact that, as much mastery as we may think that we have, it can be short-circuited very quickly by a good storm or anything along those lines. I'm going to read a little bit from this section. It was a good season. They ate through their sacks of corn and sweet potatoes and barreled salt pork like they knew they would. But as those supplies dwindled, they began to make up the difference with poke greens, parts of palm, and cattails from the pond ground into flour, as Nat had heard it done in Florida. In that way, their old life shaded into the new one with added bounties. The spring ran cool and deep with a pleasant flavor. An orange tree sprang up. Deer presented themselves for the slaughter. The chickens could not stop laying eggs. As summer ended, their food stores were almost empty, and the garden they planted was not yet ready, but they still ate pretty well. Soon they would have no need for the grubby old store-bought corn and potato sacks anymore. But then it rained. Of course it did. It had been a dry and mild summer, too dry to last, too good to trust, though of course they had trusted it. First came a big tropical storm. Quinto looked up one day and saw clouds massed in the east, the likes of which he'd never seen before. True ocean-going thunderheads berthed in the Atlantic and bound for the Gulf, with little heed for the narrow peninsula between them. When he looked up again an hour later, they barely seemed to have moved. But they were moving. By late afternoon had arrived, grim and greenly flickering, filled with the earth's healing waters. They sat inside listening as the rain hit. It rattled against the walls, and the stiff wind toyed at the roof's edges and threatened to strip it piece by piece. The house accounted well for itself, but not well enough. The water didn't pour in, it just trickled. That was how everything got wet. Clothing and bedding, tallow and wick, everything. They spent days and nights inside in the dark on a damp mattress, eating handfuls of damp corn and a few pieces of venison and some berries. After the first 4 days of rain, Lucy Quinto was seized with panic. "Are we going to drown?" she asked. Everything outside the house was water, and everything inside it was becoming water too. "Are we going to drown here?" Nat thought no, they were not, but they began to see that even if God did not drown them in a flood, there were other ways to die from rain. It was a matter of eating. Nat could not go and hunt. All the wild animals were cowering just like they were. And anyway, his gunpowder had gotten wet. They could not start a fire to cook. There was nothing that would take a flame anywhere in that landscape. The chickens had all fled to the trees, and the ox haunted the marshes. They let the dog inside. She lay pitifully on the floor and was not dry for 3 days, filling the room with her smell. None of the rains that followed were as strong as that first one, but they didn't need to be. They followed back to back over the course of a month, establishing new ponds, swelling creeks into rivers, and shrinking the earth wholesale. During the breaks, Nat and Lucy would go outside to patch the roof with new fronds, and Nat would hurry down to the pond to try for some catfish on his single fish hook. He couldn't cook the few fish he caught because he could not start a fire, so instead he sank them raw into a brine barrel in hopes that they might be edible someday. Sometimes they sat and talked. Sometimes they just sat. Sometimes they fought bitterly. Sometimes they told each other stories about what their life was going to be like soon. And oftentimes, when the rain got too loud, they'd spend a wordless hour hand in hand with their eyes shut in what was unaccountable as anything other than prayer. So that's rain. So we've seen that, and thoughts are weird that people have been experiencing a lot of that over the past week. So, like I said, this book starts with chopping down a tree, right? And just a little about me. I have a job working in conservation, land management. And so I spent a lot of time worrying about stuff like what are we doing with whether or not to chop trees down and whether or not to do a controlled burn in a given area. But this book is all about, and I think obviously a lot of books are all about the interplay between people and where they're living and the landscapes. But that shouldn't obscure the fact that many uses of the lands can be very productive and many uses can be less than productive, particularly quite often those that were introduced by some of these newcomers that I described here were of the more extractive kind. But luckily we've got people in this state, such as some of these Marjories over on this wall. Marjorie Harris Carr, Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, we have Marjorie Stoneman Douglas here, we have a whole handful of Marjories, and we might even have an environmental publication by the time they're done with it. Hats off to the Marjorie, by the way, which is an awesome thing that y'all have in Gainesville. Really cool. Or it's based in Gainesville. I actually don't know if it's all here, but you know what I'm talking about. So yeah, that some of these passages I think reflect how difficult it can be to survive, but also what happens when you strive for more than is maybe is your lot in a place like this. I'm going to jump ahead quite a bit. I've mostly read from the very beginning. I'm just going to read a little bit from a couple things from later on in this book. I think that if I had to say what section of this room that we're in right now is probably most relevant to the context of this book, and right back there we're talking about the Second Seminole War, which is also a thing that is probably more useful for understanding the history of this state than most people give it credit for. What can you say? It's a vicious conflict that wasn't much good for anyone. Although, of course, you know, it certainly had plenty of ramifications for who was able to occupy and use what lands. A failed war of Indian removal, and certainly the Seminole tribe is very much unconquered. But a lot of this book deals with that kind of very messy period of time. I should say, by the way, if anyone has any like things that they want to jump up with, what I'm trying to say is I'm open to questions later on at the end or whenever you want. Probably think it's probably really good. I just realized I have a mask on. I honestly didn't know until just now. I'm not the only one. I mean, I intended to keep it on fully because it just did this. I just didn't get it, but thought maybe I'd taken it off. I didn't. All right. So here's from, if you read some of the history, there are brief moments when there's something that almost kind of nearly looks like coexistence between Euro-American settlers and native indigenous people, and it evaporates very quickly. But you have glimpses of it in the records, and there are these really, I think, just tragic, sad things to see because you realize that there were maybe relationships here. I'm going to read a passage that is a very brief glimpse of that before the more out and out conflict. Although the conflict was inherent in people coming here in the first place, in many cases. This is a separate family and a separate set of characters called the Tersers. Ab Terser's mother held his head in her lap and stroked his pale hair. He could still see out the front door into the darkness where his father stood in a patch of torchlight. He could not see many of the people who surrounded Shea Terser there in the yard, but he could see the glint of hoops and beads and gorgets, which marked their places constellated through the dark, and the dull glow of the muskets they carried, well oiled for a long journey. Ab Terser was 10 years old. That night was the last time Runner's people would ever visit his yard. It was not so unusual for Runner to come and confer with the man he called Shea Terser. Long gestural conversations, a few scraps of English woven in, numerous winks. Old Runner had picked up the habit of winking somewhere and was elaborately fond of it. They would come from their town on the opposite side of Varner's Pond to trade horses or to offer the surplus of a catch of fish. But this now was the year of rumors and accusations. They'd been coming less often lately, and never at such strange hours. The boy watched as his father talked with the silver-haired chief. Even from inside the house, Ab could see the fatigue on Runner's face, fatigue before the journey had even began. The vice chief swung his arm in the direction they were headed, south. And soon the meeting was over, and the people were moving away from the yard, and Shea Terser came back indoors. Some of the vice chief's fatigue seemed to have impressed itself on Terser's face. He sat down in a chair and was silent for a minute before he answered all of his family's questions with a single phrase. They're gone. Jane stopped attending to her son. What do you mean they're gone? She asked. Where are they going? I don't know, Shea said. I didn't ask. They're gone. But what about their town? What about all that corn they just put in? Shea shrugged. They're gone. Asked me to trade for some powder, but I didn't have none spare. And now they're gone. Young Zill, standing in a corner with tears and a kind of rage in his eyes, said, good. Let him go. Let him go and not come back either. They better not come back the way they butchered the cows out on the prairie. Did you tell them that, Happy? Did you tell them that if they go, they better not come back? But all Shea said was, they're gone, and stared out into the darkness. Ab said nothing, but left his head in his mother's lap, let himself be held. He did not have many days left to seek comfort there. Indeed, it was maybe the last time the boy would ever be held so closely. Maybe if he'd known that, he would not have stood up and walked out the door. I want to see them, Ab said. I want to say goodbye. He walked down the front steps. They're gone, Ab, Father tried to tell him, but the boy kept walking, past the faint light from the house, and past the reach of his father's voice. He came and stood in the middle of the darkness where the Seminoles had been. The boy turned, looking for some sign of them, listening for a hoof fall or tap, clink, or voice. There was nothing. He rushed away from the house and ran around the perimeter of the lake in the dark until it came to their old town. Ab stopped dead on its outskirts, startled and afraid. The moon was bright enough to see the emptiness there. All the chickees were empty, and all the gardens stripped. Even the avenues of the village were perfectly bare, as if swept clean by the draft of their sudden flight. The livestock animals which had once roamed the place had vanished too. The silence was complete. There was not so much as an ember alive in the scoops outside the Seminoles' houses. They had been careful, as always, to extinguish their fires when they departed. So that departure there was that is the beginning of this section, which is again all about that period of time. Gainesville, Mr. Gaines, not Mr. Gaines, General Gaines, of course, a leader in the Second Seminole War. He does not feature in this passage I'm about to read. He was reputedly not one of the more bloodthirsty of the American military leaders, but he was, of which there were many, but he was among them. And here's a section where we're seeing the interactions of these settlers with the military leadership at this time and place. Where was that? Oh, that section. They're in a roadhouse and they're about to be sort of sold on the idea of the war and of living in forts. There was a crowd in the shadowed room. Not everyone inside was drunk. Some looked almost excessively sober, and the soberest of them all was Jake Primrose. He had dressed in all the finery that Florida cattle wealth could buy a man: deer leather boots polished to a sheen, an indigo blue shirt bought off a Britisher, silver buttons from Argentina via Pensacola, and a hat of black felt with not one but two bird of paradise feathers looming over the brim. He stood staring at the tops of everyone's heads with a stern expression. Next to him was a military officer, a round-faced captain in a blue uniform. They both remained staring at the tops of everyone's heads until finally Primrose drew in a long, deep breath into his lungs to speak. "Boys," is what he said, dragging out the word to its greatest possible length. One by one, eyes turned to him, conversations dropped, hats ticked back. After it got quiet, he said, "One more drink." A roar tore the room. Men leapt, hats were thrown upward to strike the low ceiling and drop to the floor, and there were cries of "Primrose, Primrose." The men rushed to the bar, where Mrs. Monroe had already poured several dozen cups of rum and set them up. Shea Terser exchanged a look with his wife and then slouched over to the bar. He returned slowly, sheepishly, wiping his mouth with his palm. If this is how the meeting began, people were optimistic about what would come next. They waited, and then Primrose drew in another deep breath. "Boys," he bellowed again in just the same way, "we are going to have war." No one spoke. The only sound was Mrs. Monroe washing the cups in the trough. "Now, here's a man from the army to tell us about it. This is Captain Woodburn." "Captain," he said, and turned toward the visitor. The man stepped forward and hid his arms behind his back. "I am honored, sirs and madams, to present myself, Captain Augustus Woodburn, 2nd Artillery, United States Army. I have taken upon myself the duty to report to you free citizens of Florida Territory." He paused and adjusted his stance. "The Seminole element is showing no desire for a legal solution to their problem. Less and less they speak of cooperation, treaties, or friendships. More and more the talk is of staying in the land where their naval strings were first cut and shedding blood if necessary to do it. The call for a move west to the reservation lands was primarily sustained by Charlie Mathla. But friends, Charlie Mathla is dead." A soft moan went through the room. "Old Charlie," said one old man, hanging his head. "Old Charlie, good old Chief Charlie." Oh. The officer continued, He has been assassinated by the one called Powell or Osceola. His body is laying in parts unknown, unburied for the crows. The white man's money is scattered over his body, and the Indians will not approach even to bury it. Likewise, the Indians will not approach the altar of good sense, and so I come to my conclusion. We are going to have war. The captain stepped back and said no more. There was heavy silence until finally someone spoke up from the back. Well, good, said Zilterser, quavering in his voice. Good. Jake Primrose jutted out his chin. So, ladies and gentlefolk, now we must determine what to do. Captain Woodmer has a proposal which we ought to hear. On the wall behind the men was a large square object covered in velvet cloth. He came and undid the velvet from its pins and pulled it away. On a board about 3 feet square, there was a picture of a fortress with streaks of pastel pinks and blues. The fortress sat on a hill. On this imagined structure, a golden sun was smiling, and a flock of white bees flew, and an entire herd of dog-like deer was grazing just outside the wall. At the bottom of the picture was written Fort Woodmer, 1835. Captain Woodmer had taken up a reed and was pointing at various details. He spoke at an accelerated tempo. This is the planned defense work of Fort Woodmer in the heart of Northeast Florida. You will see in its features a place of serene and healthful charm. All of the rations provided to our best fighting men will be provided to the commonest individual. Every last frontier is pleasure is here, without any of its drear and hazard. For the gentlemen, he said, drawing little circles with the reed, shooting parties from the battlements every morning and night. The deer are plenteous as flies, and they may even let you take pot shots with the big 10-pounder cannon, boys. For the ladies, I am told there are a dozen Dutch ovens on order, and several new model washboards, too. The houses are spacious and airy, with at least one wax paper window each. As for the children, they will get to grow up under the stern gaze of our military men, the finest exemplars of mannish virtue and uprightness. All told, Woodmer will be the finest place of resort in this territory. I hear Fort King is nice, said Toothless Smith. Fort King is a hog wallow, said Captain Woodmer. There's an extremely fictionalized idea of why people might come into these sports. Which, as we know, were not very pleasant places to live for 3, 4, 5 years. A lot of what I've written here kind of circles around the silence of what I mentioned earlier, which is the absences in our record of what we have and what we've written. The idea that to focus on, say, what the members of the Seminole tribe were dealing with felt like a bridge too far for me in writing this. A lot of this has to do with what the pioneers of this area went through, but it's very much, and I hope that this comes through in the book, it's operating in tension with the silence of what we don't have. Whether that's, again, the Seminole Indians, whether it is the large numbers of enslaved people who were in this place at this time. It's tough stuff, I know that, but we do the best we can to try to understand it. And that's what we've got here, and that's part of what the Matheson Museum is doing. And yeah, this exhibit that we have up right now, that they have up right now, is a pretty darn good example. And I encourage everyone to hang out, look around. I might just read one more short section. I'll read one more section, and then questions if you got them. Again, I'm here. This is funny. This is just a tidbit for you. I mentioned I wrote this book at least within 30 miles. Either Melrose or over there. I actually wore this shirt like every day that I was writing this book. This is like So, or just maybe, wasn't like I only owned one shirt or anything, but it wasn't that far from there, so no, I'm joking. But yeah, so again, this is just super exciting and strange, cool to be in this town to talk about the book. One more really brief section. With writing a book with a lot of pages in it, you have to figure out where everything is. It's not always that easy. I'll just read the one that it's open to, which is probably a good representative. In those early days, people could leave the fort with ease. They went and gleaned the nearby fields and shot squirrel, turkey, and deer. But somehow the time spent outside in the open made the return to its confines even worse. And so eventually the hunts stopped and they stayed inside the blockhouse and comforted themselves with the idea that something would happen soon. Troops went out, came back. Sentinels changed shifts every 4 hours. Meals were delivered morning, noon, and night, each smelling identically of cornmeal and faintly rancid bacon grease. Once a week, a supply train came and delivered letters containing no news, and for the rest of the week, the inhabitants would sit around talking about all the news the next one would bring. As it happens, where the flow of life has stopped, the future gained terrible importance. Plans, possibilities, prophecies. These were everything. They were what people lived on. No one talked about the past because they could not bear it. No one talked about the present because there was no such thing. The whole arena of life had shifted to the future, and each day became one long anticipation of itself, eventually foiled, pacing around or sitting on corn sacks, drunk by the afternoon. Ab was too young to find fault with the adults for all this, but he could not help hating it. He had one good friend, Teat Geyer's son, June. He knew how to ride hogs and galloped them around inside the walls. He taught Ab how, and they held bareback races, which attracted some attention. But this excitement would only last a little while, and then the people would return to their rough corn sacks and long jugs. June would keep on riding the hogs slowly around the inside of the fort, alone. Toward dusk, though, Ab would steal out through the gate and run down the slope into the trees. Out where the breeze actually blew and the deer actually walked, and there were ferns beneath the oaks. The boy would walk a ways and then lie down. He would stay there in the absence of noise and talk, in the presence of hares. He would gaze at the fort. From there, he could see how small it really was. He could walk all the way around this outer clearing in a few minutes, this little pine box, which contained his family and everyone he knew. Stop there. Thank you all so much. It's been really, really good to be here. I'm going to hang out there, and I've got some of these here if anybody wants one. But first, before that, does anybody have any questions or things they want to bring up? Yes, sir.
Thank you. Two. One, you've done a long time since I did,
Yeah.
and it's wonderful that, the University of Florida keeps producing authors like you. That's wonderful. One of the ones that was my favorites, and I don't know what happened to him, is Harry Cruz. So if you happen to know what happened to Harry.
What happened to Harry Cruz? Did anyone tell us? He died. I think he died pretty recently.
Oh.
Well, like past couple of years. He sounds like quite a guy.
He was something else. And I guest lectured in a couple of my English classes back in the 70s.
Oh, wow.
When he was sober, Okay, so the second question was, because you're writing about the first part of the 19th century in Florida, various territories, I believe at this time, the runaway slave thing from Georgia and Alabama pretty started, and many of these people were kind of rescued or taken in by the Seminoles. Do you ever incorporate any of the Black experience with the Seminoles in your novels?
Yes. that's a really great thing that you just brought up. That is it. So I read a book that argues that the Second Seminole War and just events around that was actually the single largest slave uprising in North America. Because what it actually was it, huge numbers of runaway slaves that moved into this area and joined in. There's so much to talk about there. It's so fascinating. Like when you're in a place where truly the ability of this area to be governed was very, very, very poor. So people could come here and whether they are escaped slaves, whether they are members of whether tribes people, there was a Seminole tribe, like, or people, convicts, any number of people. Florida was the place. I have called it, and I've seen it called the Southern Frontier, and that's accurate. Because this was a place that just wasn't particularly governable for a long period of time. That's but it's true, and that's such an amazing passage of history that I do try to bring to light here. And I think but I also think it's something that's like I would love to see more written about that phase. Yeah, thank you.
Right.
I think I can tell you what I can say is that I grew up in Florida, but I don't think I know that I wasn't given much of this history as I was growing up. I grew up in Daytona Beach, so you can Daytona Beach area, so we can claim that yes, Volusia County, but and truly I was here. I was in Gainesville before I ever knew much of anything about the fact that there were that this was basically a cattle driving state, and anything about the Seminole conflicts. Like, it's amazing how little you can live here and how little you can actually receive. I'm all about like we need to tell more stories, we need to tell more of the stories at all times. And so I'm hoping to do that. But this period is grabbed me.
You tell us how to write a book. How do you figure out the chapters, flow of it, the system?
Yeah, I don't think I know yet. No, I think that the only thing I've really learned is that you can have a plan, and then plan is what happens. It's like planning a trip, like a really fun, like a really excellent road trip, where you think you know where you're going, but then you decide you gotta take a detour through Tucson on your way to Los Angeles or whatever. Like you think you know where you're going, but then you have to go elsewhere. To get there, when you are actually on the road, you learn about what's there and what you really want to see. So that's the one thing I knew, because I had a little bit of an idea of where this book was going to go, but I was wrong for one thing. Then it also just it evolved in its own way. So yes.
Being from New York City and Miami, I never know which country to go.
Thank you so much. Yes, sir.
Yeah, are you gonna take a moment, or what's the next? Do you have another project that you're thinking about? You said you want to tell them
yeah, I think I've told a couple stories. This period in this place just captivates me, and I know I'm going to try to do more of this. I'm taking a little bit of a break in that I'm writing about something that is much more recent right now. But there's actually two things. I'm lying. I'm writing something that is set in like 1998, and then I've also got something that is very much in this period of time because I just think that there's so much to say here. So hopefully those both work out.
Yes, two things. One, I think former Mayor Gene Chalmers was asking because I understand you're in the midst of writing your memoirs.
Well, I just don't know.
If you have any advice on memoirs, then Gene would love to know that.
Wow, that'll be a heck of a memoir when it is there. Wow, thank you for being.
I lived a lot of years. Lord Roth, they say, has sticky notes that she puts in the garage up on the wall. And when all the walls are full, she won't let anyone park in the garage because that's what she's gonna. That's why I asked you what technique.
Oh, yes. Yeah, in terms of the tangible side of it, yeah, just a lot of notes and slightly poorly organized notes. And then when they kind of get out of order and be shuffled, then you realize that was the right order. If you happen to drop the pages and then you pick them back up and maybe that was the right order. Yeah, disarray and disorganization, believe it or not.
My other part is, I recently became more aware of the second Seminole battle that took place in Micanopy. And I would encourage anyone that hasn't been down there to see the display that they have on the Indian burial site and also the site of the battle of Micanopy, to go down there because they put in the last few years a really nice kiosk that has 3 parts that goes to that history very nicely. It's a beautiful area down there.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Micanopy is incredibly central to the history of that period, of course. Yeah, go on.
In writing about the nature that these people came in contact with, did you yourself, I mean, instead of being within the walls of the museum, I know you're doing environmental work, did you get out and experience what it would be like for them to slog through the swamp and experience the bones and the reptiles and everything else?
Yes. Yes, short answer, yes. You know, I'm totally, I mean, how do you put this? I'm outside a lot. You know, walking and sometimes walking places where I shouldn't have walked. I have a story where I was researching a certain area of this state that is not very well known, and I went walking and I went over a relatively, not a particularly high fence. It didn't seem like it was really meant to keep anyone out. Let's just say I ended up in what was actually a military installation in an area where they may have been, it may have not been good for my health to be standing where I was standing. But as is often the case, military installations have really incredible nature preserves around them, in case somebody knew that. Yeah, Army bases do a heck of a job at preserving wildlife habitat. It's actually a little fact. So I wouldn't advise that, but absolutely getting outside and because it's still there, you know, this landscape, this ecosystem that was difficult to live in then is still here, difficult to live in now. But it's home. So.
What was the last name you mentioned?
I'm not sure. It might be. I mean, it might take a little unpacking and stuff. Very observant. Yeah, I think that there's going into creating these characters. Some people have commented on the names before, and I think characters evolve with their names, I think, and they become more truly what they are. And sometimes the names shift a little bit. But Primrose, so one final anecdote about this, Primrose is kind of he's not the villain, he's kind of the villain of this book. He's certainly not helpful in a lot of situations. I found out about a year ago, after writing Primrose about 4 years ago, that Primrose is it's a native invasive plant. And that's about as good an example, a good explanation of what Primrose itself is. He's like he's a Florida original. He's a Florida through and through. He's a cattleman. He's the dude. He is the cattle baron of this area. And Primrose he takes what he wants to take, and he doesn't care who he belongs to. And he is a native invasive, and that's just what Primrose is. I see it every day more than I want to. So, thank you all so much for coming. Yeah, I'm going to be over here and appreciate it. Maybe one last question. Yes. It is. Yeah, thank you all so much. I'm going to be over here.